Harry Joseph Taco Bowman wasn't just another biker. He was the international president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, a man so feared by law enforcement that his name was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. For years, Bowman lived like a ghost, moving from place to place, protected by his reputation and the outlaw brotherhood that followed him. But his run didn't last forever. In June of 1999, his empire came crashing down. Not from a rival gang, not from a massive shootout, but from betrayal inside his circle and information that reached federal authorities. So, how does a man who ruled one of the most violent biker organizations in America end up cornered because of informants and law enforcement pressure? And what does that reveal about the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs where loyalty can disappear in an instant? Who was Harry Taco Bowman? Harry Joseph Bowman, better known in the biker world as Taco, was born on July 17, 1949 in Detroit, Michigan. He didn't come from wealth, privilege, or a clean suburban life. Like many kids growing up in the Motor City during that time, Bowman saw a place that was gritty, working class, and full of people who lived fast and hard. Detroit in the 1950s and 60s was a city defined by cars, factories, and a tough street culture. For young Harry, that environment shaped him into someone who would always feel more at home on the edge of society rather than inside it. By the early 1970s, Bowman had found his way into the world of motorcycle clubs, and not just any group. He connected with the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, an organization already feared across the Midwest. The Outlaws, sometimes called the AOA for American Outlaws Association, had been around since 1935. They weren't just bikers who loved the road. They carried a reputation for violence, crime, and loyalty to the brotherhood above everything else. For Bowman, it was a perfect fit. During those years, Bowman learned fast. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he had a sharp mind for leadership. Members described him as someone who could be calm and calculating in one moment and explosive in the next. What stood out most was his ability to organize, to pull people together, and to enforce discipline inside a group known for chaos. That combination of intelligence and intimidation helped him climb the ranks quickly throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. By 1984, Bowman had reached the top. He was chosen as the international president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, a title that gave him control over chapters across the United States and even overseas. Becoming president wasn't just about wearing the patch with pride. It meant carrying the responsibility of leading an organization that operated like a corporation and fought like an army. And under Bowman's rule, the Outlaws expanded their power far beyond their Midwest roots. What made him different from past leaders was his vision. Bowman didn't just want the Outlaws to be strong in local territories. He wanted them to be a global force that could rival their most hated enemies, the Hells Angels. He pushed for new chapters, demanded tighter loyalty, and made sure everyone understood that crossing him or the Outlaws came with a price. For law enforcement, this was the period when the club shifted from being a violent biker gang to something much more organized and much more dangerous. Over the next decade, Harry Taco Bowman would take the Outlaws into darker territory, building a criminal empire as one of the most feared outlaw biker bosses in America. And while his rise seemed unstoppable, the very traits that made him powerful, control, fear, and a reliance on loyalty, would also plant the seeds of his eventual downfall. The Outlaws MC, under Bowman's reign. When Harry Taco Bowman took control of the Outlaws in 1984, the club was already known in biker circles as one of the big four outlaw motorcycle gangs in the United States. But under his leadership, the group became something far more dangerous. The Outlaws weren't just a collection of local bikers anymore. Bowman transformed them into a highly structured organization that operated much like a criminal syndicate. The Outlaws system was built around a strict chain of command. At the top sat Bowman as international president, controlling decisions across the U.S. and abroad. Beneath him were national officers, regional leaders, and chapter presidents who enforced his word. Ordinary members followed orders with little room for debate. This structure gave Bowman the ability to extend his influence into every corner of the club. Rules were enforced through violence, and loyalty was demanded above all else. One of Bowman's biggest goals was to position the Outlaws as a direct rival to the Hells Angels. The Angels were the most famous outlaw motorcycle club in the world, with chapters across the globe, and Bowman believed the Outlaws deserved the same kind of power and respect. He pushed aggressively to expand chapters, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of the world. This rivalry with the Hells Angels fueled countless battles, some of them turning deadly. But expansion wasn't only about growing membership. Bowman's leadership turned the Outlaws deeper into organized crime. Federal prosecutors later described his role as similar to that of a mob boss. He directed racketeering operations, which included schemes to extort money from businesses, threats of violence to maintain control, and the use of intimidation to silence anyone who challenged the Outlaws' dominance. Under Bowman, the club also became involved in serious violent crimes. Contract killings were used as a method of enforcing power. Instead of random street violence, these were targeted murders carried out with precision, designed to eliminate threats and intimidate others. Drug trafficking was a major source of money. The Outlaws moved narcotics across state lines and into international networks, with profits helping fuel the expansion Bowman pushed for. Alongside drugs, firebombings became a calling card of intimidation. Bars, homes, and businesses connected to rivals were torched, often in the middle of the night, leaving behind destruction and fear. The scale of violence and crime during Bowman's reign caught the full attention of the FBI and the Department of Justice. By the early 1990s, law enforcement labeled the Outlaws under Bowman as one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. Federal agents considered Bowman himself among the most dangerous gang leaders operating in America, placing him in the same category as top organized crime bosses. What made Bowman especially threatening in the eyes of investigators was not only his involvement in violent crimes, but his ability to keep order within a notoriously chaotic group. The Outlaws were known for wild behavior, but Bowman managed to channel that aggression into organized action. This level of control made the club even harder to penetrate and investigate. By the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, the Outlaws had grown into a global force, with Bowman at the helm. But the same expansion, violence, and criminal empire that made them strong also placed them directly in the crosshairs of federal law enforcement. The stage was set for an intense battle between Bowman's world of outlaw bikers and the full weight of the United States justice system, war with rivals, and mounting violence. By the 1990s, the Outlaws' rivalry with the Hells Angels had exploded into open warfare. What had started as competition for territory and influence turned into one of the bloodiest biker conflicts in America. And under Harry Taco Bowman's leadership, the Outlaws were not backing down. The war wasn't about motorcycles or brotherhood anymore. It was about control of lucrative criminal markets, drugs, weapons, and extortion rackets. Cities across the Midwest and South became battlegrounds. Drive-by shootings, barroom brawls, and ambushes turned into a regular part of life in places where the Outlaws and Hells Angels crossed paths. Innocent bystanders sometimes got caught in the crossfire, drawing even more attention from police and federal investigators. One of the most violent fronts in this war was in Michigan and Florida, two states where both clubs wanted dominance. Bowman was accused of giving orders for targeted attacks on Hells Angels members and their allies. Federal prosecutors later tied him to multiple murders and attempted murders, including the killing of rival bikers who stood in the Outlaws' way. In some cases, victims were shot. In others, firebombs were used to destroy clubhouses and send a clear message: the Outlaws would not be intimidated. The violence wasn't limited to clashes with the Hells Angels. Smaller clubs that resisted the Outlaws' control also became targets. Bowman's vision for the club left no room for rivals, and chapters under his command were expected to push back with force. For Bowman, expanding power meant crushing anyone who threatened the Outlaws' reputation or business. Law enforcement agencies across the country began to link the Outlaws to a growing number of serious crimes. Investigators built cases showing how violence was used systematically to maintain dominance. They believed Bowman wasn't just aware of these attacks, he authorized them. Evidence later showed that Bowman would sit at the top of the chain of command, giving the green light for hits, kidnappings, and bombings. This wave of bloodshed drew national headlines and put the Outlaws in the same category as organized crime families. The biker image of freedom and rebellion faded under the reality of calculated murders and gang warfare. The FBI, ATF, and local police departments dedicated task forces to tracking the Outlaws, gathering evidence of their involvement in murder, arson, and racketeering. For Bowman, the biker wars may have proven his strength inside the outlaw world, but they also placed a giant target on his back. Every violent act carried out under his leadership became another reason for law enforcement to bring him down. And by the mid-1990s, the net was beginning to tighten, with investigators building a federal case that would eventually leave him with nowhere to run. FBI pressure and going on the run. By the mid-1990s, federal investigators had seen enough. The long list of murders, bombings, drug deals, and extortion tied to the Outlaws had built a solid case against Harry Taco Bowman. Law enforcement believed he wasn't just another outlaw biker. He was the architect behind a nationwide crime network. In 1997, a federal grand jury handed down a sweeping indictment. Bowman and several top outlaws were charged under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and violent crimes in aid of racketeering. For prosecutors, this was the same legal weapon used against mafia bosses, and now it was aimed directly at Bowman. But when the indictments came down, Bowman didn't show up in court. Instead, he vanished. Rather than face trial, he chose life on the run. For more than 2 years, he lived as a fugitive, constantly moving and relying on the loyalty of members to keep him hidden. Bowman's disappearance frustrated investigators. They knew he had powerful allies within the biker world, people willing to provide safe houses, false identities, and cash. Tracking him meant chasing shadows. He was smart enough to avoid phones, credit cards, or anything that could leave a trace. For federal agents, it was like trying to catch smoke. In March of 1998, the FBI escalated the chase by placing Bowman on its 10 most wanted list. That list was reserved for America's most dangerous fugitives, terrorists, serial killers, cartel bosses. Seeing a biker gang leader among them shocked the public, but for the FBI, it showed just how serious the threat was. Posters with Bowman's photo were distributed nationwide. His face appeared on the FBI website, in post offices, and even on television broadcasts. Living on the run took its toll. Reports later revealed that Bowman stayed mostly in Michigan, hiding in plain sight, but never staying in one place for long. He leaned heavily on trusted outlaws to shelter him, but the pressure was growing. Every knock at the door, every car pulling up the street could have been federal agents. By 1999, after years of violence and 2 years as a fugitive, the walls were closing in. And what Bowman didn't know was that betrayal from inside the biker world, along with law enforcement pressure, would soon end his run, once and for all. Inside the Outlaws. For years, Harry Taco Bowman believed loyalty was his greatest weapon. The Outlaws lived by a code: never betray the Brotherhood, never talk to the law. But as pressure from federal prosecutors grew, cracks began to appear inside that wall of silence. Law enforcement had learned that the only way to bring down powerful organized crime groups was through insiders. And in the case of the Outlaws, those insiders came in the form of informants, men who once wore the same patch, but turned on their brothers to save themselves. Some faced long prison sentences, others wanted protection, and a few simply decided they'd had enough of the violence. Former members began to testify about the club's inner workings, providing federal investigators with damaging information about murder plots and firebombings connected to Bowman's orders. Their cooperation gave prosecutors a clearer picture of how far Bowman's control reached. These insider accounts revealed how Bowman managed to keep his grip on the Outlaws even while on the run. They described the chain of command, the loyalty tests, and the way fear was used to silence dissent. The FBI and ATF combined these testimonies with months of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover work. Slowly, the picture of the Outlaws under Bowman became undeniable. Murder-for-hire plots, arson attacks, drug deals, and extortion schemes weren't isolated incidents. They were part of an organized plan approved at the top. For Bowman, betrayal by former brothers was a nightmare scenario. He had built his reputation on absolute control, but now, men he once trusted were giving sworn testimony against him, and with every witness that stepped forward, his options shrank. Law enforcement agencies called this shift a turning point. They no longer had to rely only on outside observation. They had voices from inside the biker world itself. Testimonies from former outlaws connected Bowman directly to violent crimes, and prosecutors used that evidence to tighten the noose around him. The idea of betrayal was especially powerful in outlaw culture. To the outlaws, becoming an informant was the ultimate act of treason, but to federal agents, it was the only way to finally break through Bowman's shield of fear and secrecy. By 1999, the combination of insider betrayal and federal pressure had boxed Bowman into a corner. The man who once seemed untouchable was now being hunted from both sides, by the law outside and by the cracks forming inside his own organization. The final break, capture in Michigan. By 1999, Harry Taco Bowman had spent more than 2 years living as a fugitive. Federal agents believed he was hiding in Michigan, moving between safe houses, relying on loyal members of the Outlaws to keep him off the radar. But despite his efforts to stay invisible, law enforcement pressure and investigative work eventually led authorities to his location. The FBI had placed Bowman on its 10 most wanted list in 1998, and with that came nationwide publicity. His photo appeared on posters, news reports, and federal bulletins. For months, investigators followed leads and gathered intelligence about his possible whereabouts. In June of 1999, federal authorities received information that pointed investigators to a location in Sterling Heights, Michigan, just outside Detroit. Bowman wasn't in a distant hideout or halfway across the country. He was practically in his own backyard, living quietly and trying to blend in. On June 7, 1999, the FBI, supported by local law enforcement, moved in. Agents surrounded the house, careful not to give him any chance to escape. Given Bowman's violent reputation and the Outlaws' history of armed confrontations, police prepared for the worst. But when the moment came, the feared biker boss didn't fight back. The arrest was quick and without a single shot fired. For investigators, it was a stunning end to years of chasing one of the country's most dangerous fugitives. The man who had eluded capture for so long was brought down by persistent law enforcement work and the breakdown of loyalty within his own organization. For Bowman, the arrest marked the end of his life as a free man. The walls he had built around himself, with loyalty, fear, and secrecy, had collapsed. The code of silence inside the Outlaws had been weakened by informants, and now, federal pressure had finished the job. The arrest of Harry Taco Bowman was more than just another criminal capture. It was proof that even the most feared outlaw leaders could be undone by betrayal and determined law enforcement work. Trial and conviction. After Harry Taco Bowman's arrest in June 1999, federal prosecutors moved quickly to bring him to trial. The evidence collected over years of investigations was overwhelming, and now, with Bowman in custody, the government was determined to make sure he would never walk free again. In 2001, Bowman faced a federal jury in Florida. The trial revealed the depth of his control over the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. Prosecutors painted him as a criminal mastermind who used the club not for brotherhood, but as an engine of violence and profit. The charges were severe: racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and violent crimes in aid of racketeering. Each charge carried the potential for decades behind bars. One of the most damaging parts of the trial came from testimony given by former outlaws who had turned informant. They described in detail how Bowman approved murder plots, how he ordered firebombings, and how drug trafficking and extortion brought money into the club. These accounts lined up with physical evidence gathered through surveillance, wiretaps, and federal raids. Piece by piece, the jury saw how Bowman ran the Outlaws like a mob boss, using intimidation and bloodshed to expand power. Bowman's defense tried to argue that the government was relying on unreliable witnesses, men who had every reason to lie in exchange for lighter sentences. But the amount of evidence was too much to ignore. Witness after witness confirmed the same patterns of violence, and the jury found the story convincing. By the end of the trial, Bowman was convicted on multiple counts, including racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. The sentence was crushing: 2 life terms in federal prison, ensuring that the man who once led one of America's most dangerous biker gangs would never be free again. For law enforcement, the conviction was seen as one of the most important blows ever struck against an outlaw motorcycle club. For the Outlaws, it was the loss of the leader who had defined their rise during the 1980s and 1990s. Prison and death. After his 2001 conviction, Harry Taco Bowman began serving his 2 life sentences in federal prison. For a man who once commanded fear and loyalty across dozens of Outlaw's chapters, the reality of life behind bars was a sharp contrast. There were no motorcycles, no brotherhood rides, and no control over the streets he once ruled. Bowman lived out his days as inmate number 03938-039, housed in high-security facilities where his power was stripped away. Even in prison, he remained a notorious figure. His name carried weight among those who followed the outlaw biker world, but for federal authorities, he was just another dangerous criminal removed from society. In March 2019, after nearly 2 decades behind bars, Harry Taco Bowman died at the age of 69 in federal custody. No dramatic ending, no escape, and no last comeback. The man who once stood at the top of one of America's most feared biker gangs passed away quietly, marking the final chapter of a violent legacy. Closing and viewer engagement. Harry Taco Bowman's story is one of power, violence, and betrayal. He climbed from the streets of Detroit to become the international president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, building an empire that rivaled the Hells Angels and terrified communities across the country. Yet for all his strength and influence, his downfall came not from a rival's bullet or a dramatic showdown, but from the voices of informants inside his own world and determined federal law enforcement work. His capture and conviction showed that no matter how feared or untouchable someone may seem, loyalty can break, and justice can find its way in. Bowman's life ended quietly in a prison cell, far from the power he once commanded. But his story raises a bigger question. In a world built on loyalty and silence, are informants the ultimate traitors, or the only heroes capable of ending a reign of terror? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you'd like more deep dives into true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned.